And we then apply a bunch of the experience we've gained through our investigation work, where we've seen so much of what often goes wrong, to say, these are the kinds of things that if you commit yourselves and each other to, then you can make a big difference with. And it is, at the end of the day, being kind to each other. So focusing on small things, not allowing small disrespect and incivilities to slide, because it's by doing that things don't escalate to the point of actually becoming harassment.
Welcome to the How Canada Works podcast. I'm Trevor Miller. With me, as always, is Adrian Blake. Adrian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, Trevor. Thank you for asking. It is a beautiful sunny day where I am anyways. And, a lot of days I wish I wasn't so weather activated, but when it's this nice out, I appreciate the motivation the sun provides.
Which is really, really nice considering, what just happened in the GTA with the floods and everything like that, which, is really just so great in who we're about to talk to, somebody who deals with this sort of thing on a regular basis. Really excited to talk to Sam Pietras, senior executive with MSP Insurance. Really excited to be able to ask her all these questions about some of these natural occurrences that we're seeing happen a lot more regularly.
Yeah, we're seeing, natural disasters, right? Like we talk about the wildfires in BC. If you remember last summer, we had significant fires in Quebec and smoke all through Quebec and Ontario. And then, I remember seeing pictures of New York City with like that yellow haze all through it. And that's not to speak of the water that we've seen in the Toronto and Burlington areas just last week. I couldn't believe the flooding. So I think it's a very topical and timely conversation. And I'm curious to find out what this actually means for insurance as an industry, and then for individuals as clients of that insurance industry.
Absolutely. So before we hop onto that, make sure that you like, follow, subscribe, and let's go talk to Sam.
Let's do it.
How you doing today?
I'm doing all right.
Good. Thanks so much for joining us today. Really excited to chat about the law. It's we had a really good pre-chat there, so I'm excited to dive into a little more in what we chatted about. Do you know Adrian already?
Many years ago.
Yes, I think we have had a connection. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Back to BNI days. Is that?
Honestly, don't remember.
Honestly, don't know. Maybe some kind of networking event, probably. But yeah, I'm not sure.
Possibly Mississauga Board of Trade or something like
that. That might be it, eh?
That might be it. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us today. A couple of things, there's so much to talk about with employment law and what's going on right now. But I think one of the things that is really interesting me right now is this shift in the way that we're employing people and the way that employees are interacting with each other and more so in just that work from home. You got the hybrid thing going on. All this stuff's relatively new, and I would assume that it's creating some level of discomfort for employees and employers. Are you seeing things like that as well from your side?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of that, and we see it in the news, of course. The federal government asking people to return a significant amount of time into the office is one of those things making headlines. So it's definitely on people's minds. And to me, it's something that employers really need to consider. What do you really need to get the job done operationally? Because I think the world has changed. We have a proof of concept where people are able to work productively from home. Employees like it, and so it's going to be more demanded. And so it is something that I think employers will have to look at how they can accommodate and allow that. But at the same time, of course, there are things that have to be adjusted, and you've got to think about how you're going to effectively manage people to get the job done. And you're going to have to think about how you do team building, how you maintain the communication and the sense of community. I think that those so there's a lot to think about.
From a legal standpoint, is as an employer, we shifted to work from home. Now there's this hybrid thing where people are working a couple days in the office, and I think a lot of employees are generally okay with that. If they can work mostly from home, spend a day or two in the office. From the legal standpoint, is there anything that says that we can force people to go back into the office now that we've kind of let go of that leash a little bit? Or where's the standpoint on this?
Yeah, there isn't much specific in kind of black and white laws, like the Employment Standards Act. Really, it will depend to some extent on what was agreed at the time a person was hired and what is in policies. Because the thing is, the employer does have the right to set most of those policies and terms and conditions, including where somebody works. And so from a technical legal point of view, employers most of the time do have the right to just say, yeah, you're coming back to the office. That's the deal. That's how we're running things. Where employers can get into trouble and what employers really cannot do is major changes to what's been effectively established as being a term or condition of the employment. And that's where the idea of constructive dismissal comes in, if it's something that would be a fundamental change to something that's become a term or condition of the employment. So if we're in a case where, well, we sent you home temporarily on an emergency basis because of the pandemic and the shutdowns, and once that's over, we've decided to go back to how it was before. Now, that might not be a good HR decision. It might not be a good way to retain people who want to work from home, but I don't think employers are going to get into legal trouble for that. But the kind of cases where employers do have to be a lot more careful is, say they've had discussions with employees who are saying, look, am I likely to ever go back to the office because I want to buy this house that's an hour away? And the employer either explicitly or kind of implicitly is like, yeah, go ahead, don't worry about it. You're going to be able to work remotely. And after the employee makes that move based on having that promise, whether it's an explicit or an implied promise from the employer, all of a sudden that changes. Now, this is a very fundamental change to something that the employee could say, this actually wasn't just a temporary thing. This got established as a term of my employment. Now it's fundamentally changing. That's where some of those issues could lie.
And what about from the employee side of things? Like, are there some things that employees can do or need to be aware of in terms of, doing this hybrid or remote work, from the employee side of things? And one of the things I'm thinking of that's crossed my mind is I've seen situations where employees have relocated and now they're in a totally different jurisdiction and they can do the same work, but now perhaps they're subjecting their employer unintentionally to employment law of some other jurisdiction. All of a sudden now, there's untold, follow-on consequences. And really the employee thinks, well, I work for a Canadian company and I have always done work in Canada for a Canadian company. What does it matter if I live in Italy? Well, the Italian legal system might have a different opinion on that. And so, what else in addition to that can employees do to be careful?
And even province to province, right, Adrian?
Right. Well, and I think what you said is spot on, that most of the time now, of course, there's lots of legal subtleties to this, but for the most part, employment relationship is going to be governed by the law where the employee is. And so, yeah, if you've moved from Ontario to Quebec, you're going to be governed by Quebec law, and that's a pretty big change. Quebec law is very different from other parts of the country. So that's something where, now I know you've asked about what employees can do. I don't think employees should be sort of sneaking into Quebec to try to take advantage of the maybe more employee-friendly laws over there. But that is something where I think an employer could reasonably say, no, we want this to be governed by Ontario law, which is what we've been doing all along, and have you sign a contract to say that. So I think the biggest thing for employees, because that's what you're asking for the advice for, is to be transparent with your employer. It may feel like, well, it's better to ask for forgiveness instead of permission, but I think that's where a lot of the trouble comes from, where the employee kind of stakes out a position, and the employer really might have that right to force you to come back. And if you're not able to say that's a termination for cause or an abandonment, and I'm not saying that to scare people. I'm just saying that, at least from what I've seen in my experience, that honesty really is the best policy, and that very often, if in that example, you want to work from Quebec, you have a personal reason to be there, you can work out how you can do that effectively. And it can be as simple as signing a contract that confirms that Ontario law applies from an employment point of view. There might be some tax and revenue Quebec stuff that you'll have to deal with, and I'll let you financial guys advise. But yeah, that would be my advice. And the other thing is, for employees who are looking to work remotely, if you can be a bit proactive with coming up with the plan, I think employers really have the fundamental responsibility for this. I'm not putting that responsibility onto you as an employee, but often what the employers are concerned about is, well, how do I manage this person if they're not there and if they're not coming in regularly? How does this person get integrated as part of the rest of the team they have to work with? These are some of the things on their mind. And I think if you can proactively go to your employer with, here's a plan, and here's a schedule that I'll check in with my manager on, and here's where I'm going to post my work or upload my work product when it's done, and really show that you've thought through how to make this work, that's probably going to be more impressive.
Yeah, I think as employers, we all have this thought process that, we're paying somebody to work a certain amount of hours, and I think that it almost needs to shift a little bit, where it's I'm paying for this amount of productivity, because as an employer, I don't really want my employee to be at home, cleaning the house and doing laundry and running errands. I want them to be working, but almost at the end of the day, it's what are they doing? What is that production level? And that might just be a bit of a mind shift from an employer perspective. It's not the hours, it's the production, right?
Yeah, and I think it has to be, because I see that concern too. And when employees are coming to employers and saying, well, it's so much more convenient when I was able to work at home because I was able to get these errands done, that's not very impressive to the employer. Right. Having said that, I laugh a little bit because I am in a profession that typically bills by the hour, by the hour you work.
Yeah.
But we're looking, and a lot of lawyers are looking to shift that. And in certain kinds of the work that we do, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but workplace training is a big area that I actually work in. We do a lot of anti-harassment work, respect in the workplace. And we also do workplace culture assessments. And we are more and more trying to bill flat fee for as much as we can, because it really should be about the value and the productivity of the work and not the number of hours you happen to spend. But back to that point, yes, one of the advantages to work from home is you have that flexibility of when perhaps you put in the hours. And policies, from the employer point of view, it's a question of policies. From the employee's point of view, it's a question of being reasonable within that flexibility that you're given. So there's a give and take on both sides. But employee might need to be available at particular times because that's when their customers or clients are available. That's when team meetings are available. But maybe there can be some flexibility at other times, and as long as the work's getting done, the fact that it's getting done at a little later instead of a little earlier. Now, having said that, we do have to keep the Employment Standards Act in mind as employers. There are rules about overtime. There's rules about maximum hours an employee can work in a day. So we do have to make sure that all of those basic requirements are being complied with.
And how would you do that if you're somebody's on salary and nobody's clocking in, clocking out? Is there some good rules for that?
Yeah. So first of all, you do want to look at whether there are exemptions that apply, because there are some categories of employees who are exempt from some of these overtime and hours of work rules. The misconception, though, is, well, if somebody's salaried, then they're exempt and it doesn't matter. And that's actually a misconception. It's not true. You have to fall within specific exemptions. So other salaried employees, these rules will still apply to. So some of the main exemptions are managers and supervisors, IT professionals, and of course, we can imagine these people doing some of their stuff from home. So the other things that can be done, there are first of all, some mechanisms under the Employment Standards Act. There are things like overtime averaging agreements, which, if the employee and employer agree to it, allows them to, instead of billing or paying for overtime when you've worked over 44 hours this one week, we sort of average it over multiple weeks. And you might say, well, why would an employee agree to that? Because it just means they're getting paid less for the same amount of work. But maybe the employee will agree to it if that's the condition for being able to work from home or this more flexible schedule. And there's also ways that under the Act that employers and employees can sign written agreements to allow them to work additional hours. And actually, the law changed in that regard a few years ago now. Certain of these agreements used to require ministry approval, and that was removed. So it's actually much easier for employers and employees to set up these agreements to exceed what would normally be maximum hours of work.
Interesting. It sounds like an opportunity for negotiation on both sides. Probably neither party is able to dictate everything that they want, and maybe that used to be more true, depending on the kind of overall employment market we were in at the time. If it's more of an employee or an employer's market, who's got the power. Sounds like now both have a fair amount of power, and there's a little bit of leverage, and settling on middle ground is like an appropriate part of the hiring process. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree, and that's what I would hope for is that there can just be some reasonable compromise on both sides.
Yeah. What do you find that any of this is relevant to age? And the reason I think about it is I just kind of imagine if you are a younger person, you're newer in your career, you're less experienced. The value of FaceTime with your boss and FaceTime with your coworkers who may one day be your boss, and the perception of the work getting done by you physically being in person could be more valuable than if you've established your career or you've been in your role for a decade. If your boss and the people under you and the people beside you all understand that you are a competent person and can do the job, maybe all of a sudden it's less relevant to be in person. I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think for people who are newer, who are establishing themselves, improving themselves, that being there in person, being able to have those unplanned interactions, being able to just pop down the hall to ask somebody a question instead of having to schedule a Teams meeting that fits into your calendar, to be able to do that can be really helpful for learning your craft. And the somewhat irony, I hope I'm not making assumptions, but I am making assumptions. But the somewhat irony is that probably people of the younger generation are more likely to be comfortable with, I can just do it from home. I'm very comfortable on my computer, and why do I have to commute in? They also might be the ones who have to live farther away from just for financial reasons and make it harder to get in. So it's not an easy situation, and I do think there needs to be a balance. But I have to say, as someone who's now kind of in the middle, I'm not old yet, but I'm also not new and junior anymore. That being able to have those in-person interactions, both as a mentor and as a mentee, I find really valuable.
Yeah, I agree.
Before we keep going on, we kind of jumped into this right off the hop because I find this so fascinating. But I'd love to just wind it back a little bit there, Brian, and because you're not just in employment law. We kind of got into all the things that you do from your end. And I think it's just so interesting in how you've taken your career from being more in that employment law kind of silo to, how it's expanded. So could you just like give us a little bit of a overview on what that looks like?
Yeah. Would you like me to talk about kind of the journey, the history, or more what I'm doing now?
Yeah, more what you're doing now, unless the journey of the history is something you find.
It's not. It's not that much fun. It was really all I'll say about the journey and the history was it wasn't intentional. It wasn't like, I set out to move my career in this direction. It was really gradually over time. And so what I would say our firm's mission is building positive and respectful workplaces. And I like using the word transform. So transforming workplaces into places of dignity, respect, and belonging. And that's something that I really care about because, people spend 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours a day at work. And so the experience that they have while they're there is so fundamental to somebody's well-being and their enjoyment of life. And also to the productivity for the company or the organization of the work they're doing. So one of the major things that we do and that I've spent a lot of time doing in the last few years has been workplace harassment investigations. So you get called in to be a neutral third-party investigator when there's been a complaint. And so that involves generally interviewing the person who made the complaint, interviewing the person who the complaint is against, interviewing witnesses, reviewing documents, and trying to do some fact-finding to figure out what happened and hopefully do that fact-finding in a way that's useful that allows the employer to make good decisions about how to address this issue, resolve conflict, and move forward. And increasingly, where I've been getting more and more into is trying to be even more proactive than that, because that is still responding to a complaint that's been filed. And so I've been working on areas of HR and kind of workplace respect that can be more proactive in terms of offering training, both for employees on respect in the workplace, but also for managers and supervisors and HR people for proactively addressing these issues, and doing culture audits and culture assessments where we do surveys and interviews to try to diagnose potential challenges and make recommendations to improve workplace environments before things have escalated to the point of one of these formal complaints.
That sounds really interesting because I think as every employee has sat through a bunch of, HR onboarding videos where you got to watch a bunch of junk and nobody cares. And it basically says, be nice to people. Like, okay, that should be a fairly basic thing to understand if you're going into.
One would hope.
One would hope. I assume there is a lot more that can be done there that you are doing. And so can you expand further? What is it that the employer or employees maybe are missing in this kind of, beyond treat people well? What does your training go into on a high level that we're not thinking of?
Yeah, that's a great question because the reality is that workplace harassment persists despite how obvious the basic concept of just be nice to people might seem to be. And the more I think our outside society and our politics gets polarized, the more things like that filter into the workplace, and we're seeing more conflict and even rising to the point of harassment. So there has to be another approach. And so I'm not saying that what I do is perfect or the be all end all or what we do, but There is some research on why a lot of this traditional anti-harassment training doesn't work. And it's both because it tends to be too legalistic. So it's about, this is what the law says, this is what our policy says, this is what you have to do. People are like, yeah, I think I know that already, rather than being about behavior change. And the other reason is that it tends to engage people as if we think they're the perpetrator. So you better not do this, right? And of course, nobody thinks that they're the perpetrator. Nobody wants to see themselves that way. And the vast majority of people aren't, actually. It's a small minority who are really the bad actors. And so people don't really feel like this applies to them. They're not paying attention to it. So one of the big approaches and philosophies that we like to take is a bystander intervention philosophy. So that includes bystander intervention training itself, which is if you do see something, what can you do about it? But it also is a broader philosophy, I think, that infuses how we approach the training, which is when I'm standing in front of you, I'm not treating you like you're the perpetrator. I'm treating you like somebody who has a role to play, because every single person has a role to play in building the kind of culture we want to see. So how do we work together to do that? And we then apply a bunch of the experience we've gained through our investigation work, where we've seen so much of what often goes wrong, to say, these are the kinds of things that if you commit yourselves and each other to, then you can make a big difference with. And it is, at the end of the day, being kind to each other. So focusing on small things, not allowing small disrespect and incivilities to slide, because it's by doing that things don't escalate to the point of actually becoming harassment.
So, harassment typically, and you are obviously the legal expert in definitions of this, I'm sure. But to me, harassment would be, I say something towards you in a manner that is hurtful. What's the difference between kind of a harassment, and where does that go towards, like, just more of a cultural insensitivity or something along those lines? And what I'm trying to get at with this is, I was a director previously, and we had the diversity and inclusion training, and what I realized from that was we were screwing up. We weren't doing it the right way. We had a bunch of white males who enjoyed sports and wine and these sorts of things. So as we were building rewards programs and different things, it was, let's get tickets to a Leafs game. Let's go to this winery. Let's go do this. And our hearts were in the right place. We just didn't know what we didn't know. And, not everybody wants to go to a Leafs game. Not everybody drinks alcohol. So we started, through some of the training, to step back and really realize what was going on. So where's the difference between us just being blind versus kind of that harassment side, and like where's that line fit in?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a big question with a bunch of pieces to it, but I might start just by saying that look, we're all learning and growing. I thought it was funny, actually, as you were speaking, that our firm, even though this is the work that we did, we've done events, or at least one event I remember at winery many years ago, and I look back at it and I'm like, well, we would never do that today, because of course there are people for whether religious reasons or other reasons don't drink alcohol and would be excluded by that. So it is this ongoing journey where to me, and I'm a white man as well, and so I say this with my caveats, but to me, inclusion is, it's the bigger goal. And inclusion is going to be really about listening to people and trying to, as much as we can, to understand different people's experiences and create systems and structures that allow us to be more inclusive for everybody, or that remove barriers for everybody to participate. And that is a long way from the spectrum of where we're talking about harassment, but it might be somewhere on the same spectrum. Where harassment, and I'll turn legal just for a second. So it is defined, and there's a whole long definition. I'm not even going to get into all of it, but one of the key parts of the definition is that it's behavior that either the person doing it knows or ought to have known was unwelcome to the person receiving it. So it's this idea of, did you ought to have known it was unwelcome? And on top of that, because hey, there's some things that, hey, if I'm a manager and I'm giving you a bad performance review, of course I know it'll be unwelcome to you, but that's not harassment. There are exceptions for reasonable management action. There's also a certain level of seriousness, and they use the word vexatious, that it has to be. And it has to either be a single incident that's very serious, or it has to be a series of incidents. They call it a course of conduct. So I know I'm being legalistic, but I actually think that this definition is kind of practical, because what it means is that we have a chance to see, generally, it's either going to be a single incident that's very serious, and that kind of in this day and age, almost anybody by the nature of that behavior ought to know that that's highly likely to be offensive. It's, it's that serious, it's that egregious. Or you're in this series of events or course of conduct situation where the person has seen the other person become more and more uncomfortable with it over time. Even if the other person hasn't spoken up, there's probably been body language, there's been some kind of reaction, and it reaches the point where we can say, look, you ought to have known that this was no longer being welcome, and you can stop that behavior, or you needed to stop that behavior. So to me, when I think of harassment, I do think of it in a legal sense, but I think that legal definition is practical in that way, where it's at a certain point you cross the line and you say, look, you ought to have known that behavior was unprofessional, was unwelcome to the person, and needed to stop. And but at the same time, I think short of merely not harassing people, that should be our very basic baseline, is not harassing people. Then we can start looking into, but how do we make things even more inclusive? How do we take away even more barriers that could stop people of different backgrounds or different cultures or different beliefs of participating in everything we want to do?
So that dovetails perfectly, because you mentioned as well your cultural assessments. And so what do you find out in a cultural assessment? Like, I think generally speaking, if you paid attention to business, we've learned there's a lot of value in diversification of culture, which can mean a lot of different things. And I'm not just talking about people's religious backgrounds or where they come from. I mean, how they think, where they went to school, what they know, what they have experienced, like broad sense of diversification in culture. Like, what do you find out through a cultural assessment, and what do people do with it?
Well, what you often find out is that people have a certain perception about, for example, how communication is in the workplace, or how management or leadership is acting in the workplace. You often find out that there is some issue that leadership had no idea that this issue was bothering so many employees, or they might have known, oh yeah, like that's an annoyance, but didn't realize how big a concern it was, that you can actually have a quick fix to. So, and I really love when I can get things like that. And then sometimes, or often, what you learn is about where the cliques are, where the fault lines are, and we can start to look at, well, what can we do to bring these groups together? So it's so broad and varied what might come out of it. One that was quite interesting was it was two different organizations within the employer, and the members of these two different groups hated each other and couldn't get along, and so we're trying to figure out why. And it turns out that it was mostly an issue of role definition, where one of the groups thought that the other one was a support service to themselves, whereas the first one thought that they were much more of an independent group or entity. And so we have one being frustrated that they're not getting the support they need, and the other being frustrated that they're being told what to do all the time and without respect for them. And this almost naturally lends itself to a number of different possible solutions, but that starts with defining, well, what is the purpose of these groups?
What about conflict resolution? Like, I think that's something that you guys look at as well. We've done some work with some professionals around how to frame conflict and how conflict is different than fighting, for example. Because there's a certain amount of conflict that's often necessary in business. There's a certain amount of value to a healthy amount and approach to conflict. how do you think about that in the work that you do with the employers that you work with?
Yeah, no, exactly that there is conflict is both inevitable and can be very healthy and very important. So I kind of like that quote. I don't know who actually said it, but that if everybody's thinking the same, then somebody's not thinking. Although what I would add to that quote is that probably if everybody says they're thinking the same, somebody actually is thinking differently, but doesn't feel like it's safe to speak up and say so. So psychological safety is really important to get those conflicting views. And so we look at it on different levels. One of the things that we will do is one-on-one conflict mediations between two employees who are in conflict, and helping them to understand the other party's point of view and figure out a way that they can work together. But on the broader scale, as you were talking about, because we give training on this as well, we want to enhance people's ability to have conflict successfully and in a healthy way, because it is necessary, and we really don't want people just suppressing those other viewpoints. Like, that doesn't help anybody.
And I feel like this is kind of where we've gone culturally over the last number of years, is that if I don't jump on whatever cause it is that you are holding dear at this moment, that's I'm almost the enemy. So we can't have a divergent thought process in, whatever it is going on. And you can almost take, and any of the movements that we've had over the number of years, and you and I talked about a few with the Me Too and the vaccines, and and diving into kind of free speech more recently. And like, how do you bridge that, where somebody is talking about a cause that I feel has more than just that point of view? How can I now approach that, or do we just not talk about that in the workplace? Is that just not a workplace conversation that needs to happen?
Yeah, it's tempting to say that that's just not a workplace conversation, and I think there's pros and cons to that. We want to be professional. We want people to feel comfortable and included in the workplace, but there's also a certain point where making if people hold so strongly to this belief, then having to suppress that about themselves all through the work day when they're spending so many hours there, that can be uninclusive, and that can be challenging too. So I do think it's a bit of everything in moderation and within reason, but a lot of the standard things that we say about conflict, I think, can apply. And so it's really trying to create a safe environment that starts with a shared purpose. What is the shared purpose of us having this conversation? Because if it is just, I want to win my argument and beat you down, then that you probably feel the same about me, and that's not going to go anywhere. So if it's, look, we want to, because we want to work well together and we care about each other, we want to get as close as we can to a shared understanding. I'm not saying, now that sounds very kumbaya. I'm just throwing that out as if we're going to have these discussions, there should be a purpose to it, and it should be a shared purpose. And I think if we establish what that shared purpose is at the start, that's something that, as the conversation itself gets heated, we might be able to pull ourselves back to, and hey, how can we serve our shared purpose here? I don't know. That's obviously a very partial answer, but I think that might be the at least first step toward an answer.
Very, very lawyer view. Not gonna fully commit, but I feel like there's been just with social media, it's kind of given everybody the platform to have an opinion and to shout it out. And I would assume that that's kind of come into the workplace a little bit as well, where I've got my Facebook group that all believe in the same thing I believe in. Now I'm going to bring that into the workplace. Like, is that something that's been an uptick, or is that?
Yeah, it is. And I've done investigations that have to do with what people were posting on Facebook. And there is this fine line between what is, people have a right, especially on their own time, on their personal accounts, to express political opinions versus what is something that crosses that line, that by this person making these public statements that and they can be associated back with who their employer is, that now affects the employer's reputation, affects other people in the workplace, because I have to work with this person and I know what they've been saying about people from my group or people from whatever other group. And now it does become the employer's business. So it's not easy, but I think from an employer standpoint, I would encourage you to have a social media policy and be clear about what the expectations are for employees inside and outside of work. And for employees, you just need to remember that anything that's on the internet is permanent, and somebody probably will find it. So it's not to suppress, like the kind of political speech that a good democracy always needs to have. But if it's something more than that is going to really be demeaning or offensive to somebody, don't expect that to just remain in your private life. It's just not the reality.
So that can go back, and the employer would have a legal leg to stand on if it's something that went against their policies and culture.
Yeah, and not even that new. There were two cases, and this was over a decade ago now, about Twitter posts by firefighters, and there were two different cases where one was more extreme than the other. And so in one case, the firefighter's employment was actually terminated, and an arbitrator upheld that. Had used a lot of racially derogatory, demeaning statements, and was stupid enough, I guess in that particular case, to be wearing his full fire gear and uniform in his profile photo. So it clearly linked him back to the employer. And so an arbitrator said, look, this reflects on the employer. The employer has a right to protect his reputation in this way. In the other case, they said, well, the employer actually overreacted by firing this other person. What the person did wasn't quite as bad, but still allowed the employer to use some discipline, just not as much as termination.
One of the things to kind of take a little bit of a switch here, a lot of our clients and our audience really is kind of getting into that retirement time, and I'm really interested in how employees and employers are going to be kind of linked going forward. I know that there's a lot of people in their 60s and even into their 70s that are still ambitious and want to work either for wants or needs. And then we also have technology that's changing quite a bit. What are you seeing in these kind of this aging population that's sticking around the workforce longer?
Yeah, I'm seeing. I'm seeing a few things. I'm definitely seeing that people want to work for longer, and as you said, whether that's based on want or need doesn't really matter at this point. Mandatory retirement in Ontario was eliminated about 20 years ago now, so that's almost ancient history. The idea, at least legally, that we expect people to retire at age 65. So, some of what I'm seeing, and I speak more to the employer side just because that's more of my clients, although I do work with employees as well. What I'm seeing is more of employers, I think, unfortunately making assumptions that, because this employee is older, they don't want to work as hard, but they still want to get the paycheck, or because this employee is older, they won't be able to learn the new technology. But, I don't want to take the steps to actually manage this person whose performance, the employer feels has slipped compared to where it was, because, why should I be mean to them? They're just going to retire soon anyway. Or, old dog can't learn new tricks anyway, so what's the point? And so to me, those are the kind of ageist attitudes that older workers are sometimes up against. Now, yes, maybe in some individual cases, performance actually is slipping, but from the employer's perspective, the answer is manage the performance the way you would for any other employee. Don't just say to yourself, well, they're going to retire soon anyway, because A, they might not. And B, you have someone with all of these years of experience, both life experience and work and industry experience. So if their performance is slipping a little bit, they're probably still offering you a lot that potential replacement won't. And so deal with whatever that issue is exactly how you would with any other employee, and see if we can get this person performing the way we want them to perform in that area, because they've got all these other great benefits that they offer. And similarly on the technology, during the pandemic, my grandmother, who at the time was 89 years old, learned how to connect to Zoom so that she could have Zoom calls with her grandkids and great grandkids. And so, I don't believe this idea that we just can't learn something new. It might be harder. You might need to really dedicate to that training. But again, if you have somebody with all of this, both life, work, and industry experience, why not make that investment to help them?
Yeah, I think it's really silly when an employer thinks that, a 66 or 67-year-old is over the hill and should have retired a couple of years ago. And when you look at the folks running, especially in the U.S., Congress, look at the ages of the folks running for president right now. But it's the same is true in our political system in a lot of cases too. Like the people who are making some of the most important decisions for our countries, in North America, are at that kind of age group. And I know that's not necessarily a problem, but I think it's a weird dichotomy to have this kind of idea that they can't do the work, but they can run the country. Like,
right?
No, like, can they do the work, regardless of the age? Is really, I think, a more important approach to things.
Right, absolutely, and it's just what I do see is employers saying, well, no, look, this person just can't do the work anymore, or they're not, whether they can or not, they're choosing not to work as hard anymore. And I would say, well, look, what benefit do you still get from them? And it's probably pretty substantial. So work on the things that need to be worked on as you would with an employee of any age, or make the decision that if this employee is not working out for you and is not producing what needs to be produced, lay them off or terminate them if you would do the same for an employee of any other age. And if not, then, well, that's a human rights violation. That's age discrimination if it's not. But my bottom line message is, how would you handle this with an employee of any age? And it really shouldn't be different, except that if anything, you should probably be more inclined to want to make it work and try to keep this employee because of the years of experience that they have to offer you.
So that's really interesting on if they're already employed by you, but there's a lot of people that are looking for that second career, in their 60s, and how do you as an employer look at somebody who is, definitely in their last stage of their working career, and make a decision to hire or not hire, and not take that age into account?
This is where, unconscious biases might play a role, and we want to do what we can to screen for that and try to prevent that in the context of age, just as we would try to do that for race or gender or any other protected ground. Because, again, going back to the legal point of view, it is a straight up human rights violation, illegal to refuse to hire somebody because of their age, because they're seen as being too old. And so you might feel in some ways like, well, I want someone who might be here for the longer term, and I don't think this person will be. It's no different from when employers would say, well, I don't want to hire a woman of a certain age because she's going to get pregnant and go off on leave. Well, that is clearly illegal and discriminatory, and there's really no difference between that and the situation we're talking about. So to the extent we can avoid even getting some identifying information at the application stage so that we're not unconsciously biased by it. Obviously, once we're sitting in an interview with somebody, we're going to know, or we see some details on the resume of how many years they've been around. But I think that's really just the balance that the employer has to consider is, like, if somebody has this experience to offer you, why wouldn't you take it? And if you're not going to take it, you do have to ask yourself, well, is this actually an age-related bias that both legally and hopefully morally is going to get me in trouble?
Right. Perfect. Brian, I want to say thank you so much. I really appreciate kind of your approach to things. I think there's a lot of value in this conversation, whether our listener, owns a business or is high up in a business and is thinking about this from the employer point of view or from the employee point of view. I understand from what you said earlier, you work primarily with the business side of things, but I think there's an opportunity potentially for employees to bring you into a relationship with their employer as well, because I think there's a lot of opportunity to be proactive about these things. That also was a word that you used earlier, and we see the consequences in the social media and in the public sphere of not doing this well. And so I think there's a real opportunity to make improvements. And so I appreciate what you are doing. Thank you for sharing it with us and with our audience. And we will make sure that in the show notes for this episode, everybody can find where you are. So if there is an opportunity for them to be in touch with you professionally, we'll make that easy for them.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both so much. This was a lot of fun to do, and appreciate the opportunity.
So Trevor, I thought that was a spectacular conversation with Sam. She covered a ton of ground. She obviously focused a lot on the housing insurance industry as opposed to like auto or commercial. But I think with all the flooding that we've seen lately in the GTA, like that's what really resonates at the moment. And I think, I learned a lot. I was reminded of a lot. I definitely appreciated the conversation there with Sam.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's only so much time to pick her brain in this context anyways. And just after what has happened here and you see what's going on in BC with the wildfires, you see what's going on in Ontario with the flooding. It just seems like, there's so much going on. And I was actually really surprised with the fact that some of those insurance companies have added these claims to make sure that they are covered, give a little more clarity on what is there. We always think, and you and I, like you mentioned, are in the more, life insurance side of things. But insurance companies, even from my standpoint, a lot of times you think of it as this big, dirty, mean kind of entity.
It's us versus them, right? But it's not.
Absolutely. I think at the end of the day, they want to make sure that if there's a claim there, they're going to put the money out. And if it's not there, then maybe you should just have that look with your broker or yourself if you understand it, and just make sure what's covered or what you think's covered is actually covered.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know what I'm doing with my afternoon. I'm going to have my iPhone out and be running around my house making videos of all the stuff I own and, checking some of those boxes. And apparently I need to call the local, disaster restoration guy and see if we can have a lunch or something. Things I wouldn't have thought of before.
See, I ride bikes with a guy locally here, so I've got that covered. Yeah, exactly. So
perfect.
Yeah, lots to do, and I think at the end of the day, it's such an interesting conversation, and kind of has me as well going back and thinking about everything that I have and just making sure, even if it's going to cost me a couple extra dollars, it's probably better to pay that now than all of a sudden to be going to put in a claim when that massive disaster happens, and hopefully not, but and not being able to put a claim in. And like I said in when we were talking with Sam, I had that go through with my bikes, and it probably cost me a little bit more to make sure that was done. But when my bikes actually got stolen, and I had a couple high-end bikes stolen It was just so easy because it was covered. It was there. There was no questions. It was, super, super easy process.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a pretty positive claims process in a minor fender bender a few years ago where I was rear-ended, and same sort of thing. The company that Sam had me with, and I think I'm still insured with them. It was really a smooth claims process. And my thing was, I had my bike rack on the back of the car and it was damaged, and they just, I didn't think they were going to cover it because it's not the car. Right. But if it's attached to the car, then they do cover it. So I appreciate that because those things are silly expensive for what they are. And, luckily my bikes weren't on the rack, but the rack was toast. So I was glad to have it covered in addition to my vehicle, obviously.
And speaking about bikes, Adrian, it's a blue sky day there. You're working
and I'm
hard.
talking to you.
There's been lots of rain. Go. Let's say goodbye so you can go get a ride in. Go enjoy some of this blue sky here.
Sounds good. Thank you, Trevor. And for our listeners, just another reminder to like, follow, subscribe. If you are enjoying these conversations, then perhaps you will want to hear more of them. And if you subscribe, then you will. Thanks.
Wonderful. Happy investing.
Take care.